Hello, my name is Eric Parsons, and I'm an associate teaching professor of economics at the University of Missouri. I'm also our department's director of undergraduate studies, so I'm in charge of our undergraduate economics program here at Mizzou. And today I'd like to talk with you a bit about depth or breadth. What's the best approach to teaching a principles class? And I will say I'm a micro principles guy, so it's probably coming more from a micro principles viewpoint, but I think a lot of these ideas will also carry over to macro principles as well. And I think there's kind of two broad questions that we need to ask when answering this question. And then we'll see there's lots of kind of sub questions that get brought up when we start asking these questions as well. So the first question is to know your audience. All right. So the kind of questions we need to think about here is this class mostly made up of majors or non-majors? And a somewhat related question, will the students in the class go on to take additional economics courses? Obviously, if they're economics majors, they're going to go on to take economics courses, but are they business majors and so on? They're more likely to take future economics courses than students perhaps in other majors. So are they going to take additional economics courses, or is this really going to be the main one that they have? And then if they go on to take additional courses, what courses are those going to be? What types of classes follow from the principles classes? And then I think another kind of question related to the audience is, how big is the class? Is the class a large lecture, or is it maybe more a smaller class where you can do more discussion and things along those lines? So I think those are kind of the key things we need to think about when we're thinking about the audience. Then the second big question is, what are the goals of the class? What are your personal goals teaching the class? And the first couple goals I have here, I think, are more ones that are going to be arguments for a depth approach. So, and I think these often are maybe more traditional ways of looking at the class. We want to master a few key topics in this subject. And a very common one here is to ensure the students have the technical skills necessary to succeed in their later economics classes. I think both of these goals kind of lend themselves to a depth approach. However, I think there are other goals that many of you might have for a principles class that might argue in the favor of breadth. So, for example, we might want to promote the major, and this can be in two different ways. One is just promoting it broadly to get more majors. Also, you might want to diversify your majors, so that diversify the types of students you have in your major. So I guess in economic terms, we're talking like an extrinsic and an intrinsic margin here, right? So those are the types of things. Are we getting more? Are we changing the composition of the majors that we have? And then another goal you might have is just wanting your students to connect to economics in their everyday lives. So that's another key aspect that you might want to think about when you're developing your classes. So given these questions, I think it's important to give a little context about what I teach, which then relates to those questions being how I answer those questions. So I teach a large lecture multi-section principles class at a large public institution, University of Missouri, around 1,000-ish students a semester. Often there's 3 or 4 sections of this class, of which I will lecture for 2 directly. And then the other sections, at least at the current time, the lecturer is one of our top PhD students. But we work together. It truly is one class. We use Canvas at Mizzou. So we have one Canvas page for all the sections. All the students take the same homework, take the same exams. The lecture notes are the same as well. So it's really one big class split up across multiple lectures. And an interesting aspect for my class is over half of the students who take my class are business students. So Principles of Economics is a requirement for these students, and that's why they're in the class. And these students actually will go on and take some more economics classes. They are required to take both of the principles classes, micro and macro. Many of them will go on and take like a money and banking class, maybe an intermediate micro class. So they are going to get some additional economics coursework later on in their degree program. The remaining students in my class come from a wide variety of degree programs. So economics is in the College of Arts and Science at Mizzou, which is the liberal arts college. And so we get a fair number of majors from that, but we also get a lot of engineering majors, journalism majors, and so on. And these students, most of them are probably not going to take additional economics courses. They are likely taking my class as a gen ed requirement. And so unless I can convince them otherwise, this might be the only economics class that they take, because most of the students who enter my class do not enter as economics majors. We have very few people who come into Mizzou with a declared economics major. So very few of my students are already declared economics majors when they start the class. So given this context and kind of given my goals, my general view of how I approach principles is to go wide. And so I largely think of principles as an advertisement for the discipline. What are the many and varied topics that we study as economists? And I think the more topics that you cover, the more likely you are to find hooks for students, which leads to that goal of promoting the major. And I know we're economists, so we like data. So I have some data to kind of back this up. So this is data from our program at Mizzou going from 2015 to 2021. This first one, the bars are the number of majors, and then the line is the percent of all majors in the College of Arts and Science that are economics majors. And you see we have a dip at the beginning. If you remember, in that time frame, Mizzou was in the news, maybe not always for the most positive reason. So the overall college and university saw a dip in enrollment. But since that time, we've seen a very steady growth in both the number of majors and the majors as a percent of the overall College of Arts and Science. And then this is a similar graph, except this is credit hours generated. So it's not number of majors, it's credit hours generated. That can be important depending on kind of the revenue model that your college or university has. You notice kind of at that beginning period, our percentage of hours stayed pretty steady, even though the number of hours fell, because that's when Mizzou had that enrollment decline. And then we've seen that steady increase since. Now, I think it's worth noting, for all the econometricians out there, this is probably not a causal relationship. There are other factors involved aside from having kind of a breadth-based economics course. One thing we did is we revised our major. We created a new track for the Bachelor of Science degree to make it easier for double majors and so on. But even with that in place, we have to hook the students to get them to want to take that Bachelor of Science. And at this point in time, we've actually, at Mizzou, economics is the 5th biggest major in terms of number of majors in the College of Arts and Science, and we're the 3rd biggest major, or 3rd biggest department, I should say, in terms of credit hours generated. So I think this breadth approach has been successful in promoting the major. And so I think it's definitely been successful in terms of numbers. And I think it does have the opportunity to appeal to a wider array of students. I know that there are going to be some other speakers in EconEd talking about kind of adding more diversity topics to their courses. And by going wide, by having a breadth of topics, it gives you more opportunities to do so. And I will say here at Mizzou, we have a diversity intensive requirement, which means every student in the College of Arts and Science has to take at least one diversity intensive course. And so these courses are ones that there's a committee that kind of decides if they meet this requirement, and our Principles of Microeconomics class meets that requirement. And so we are considered a diversity intensive course, partially because we have this breadth of topics that allow, and then that also allows us to tie in these diversity topics as well. And also, if we have a breadth of topics, it also increases the likelihood that students connect economics to the world around them, because they have more opportunities to do so. They see more ways that economics is related to their everyday life. And I would argue that the topics that the students find most engaging are often ones that are the most likely to be dropped if we really dive into a depth-based approach. I also, since I'm the director of undergraduate studies, I'm responsible for evaluating transfer credit to Mizzou. And so I often look at syllabi from principles courses from other institutions. And to me, like a principles of micro course, there's kind of 2 key pillars it has to have. We have to have supply and demand, and we have to have some theory of a firm, like perfect competition, monopoly. And so those are kind of the 2 cores, and most principles classes meet those. But there are a lot of other really interesting topics that kind of go beyond those 2 core pillars. So I teach from the Cowan and Tavrock book, so it's very nice to have Dr. Cowan in this section as well. And so here are some examples from that textbook that I think that students find very interesting, but that also would likely be dropped if we really tried to narrow in on just a few topics. So there's a chapter on networks, platforms, and the economics of free goods. Students love this chapter because it talks about social media and all these services that they're so used to using in their everyday lives. So this is a great chapter that really gets the student interest, but one that you might not cover if you're focusing strictly on depth. Public goods, tragedy of the commons, these kind of market failure type questions, I think, are ones that really grab students. Students are also tend to be very interested in politics, so kind of looking at the political economy type questions, another one that students really enjoy. I think a chapter that's very unique to Cowan and Tavrock, it's more of a political philosophy chapter that's on economic ethics and public policy, and kind of looks at different arguments against using economics to guide public policy, gets into the ideas of John Rawls, Robert Nozick, the utilitarians. So this is a topic that students really find interesting. You get lots of good questions in this chapter, but definitely one that probably is not one of the first ones taught when you're kind of going down the list. And as I mentioned, I have a lot of business students. So there's a chapter on managerial economics, managing incentives, that the students really like as well. And notice these are all high number chapters, right? We're getting into the 20s here. These are chapters you might not get into if you're diving deep into some of those earlier chapters. Also, for me, as I mentioned, for many of my students, this might be their only economics course or one of the few that they take. And so one of my key goals is I really want them to leave my class knowing that economics is way more about supply and demand, way more than just about firms and how firms behave. Many of my students come into class with very little idea of economics. They think economics is just about money. I want them to know that economics is about way more than money. And really, the argument I make to my students is if you have people involved, if you have decision-making involved, you have economics involved, which is almost every aspect of our daily lives. And so by going broad, we can get that viewpoint. Also, for those students who do continue on with economics, including the ones that hopefully I recruit through my principals class, I think they actually have a lot of time to fill in and review those technical details and get caught up on those pieces that maybe they didn't quite master in principals. And I would argue that we have to get them through the door in the first place, or whether or not they have technical skills doesn't even matter, right? And so to me, that recruitment of the major, that promotion of the major is really a key important goal from my principals class. But we are economists. We know that everything has trade-offs, right? And in the Cowan and Tabarrok book, that's big idea number 3, trade-offs are everywhere, right? So let's talk a bit about the big trade-off here. The big drawback of a breadth-based approach is the pace. To cover all these topics, you have to move pretty quickly. And we cover lots of chapters. We have to be moving at a pretty good clip to get through the material that we want to get through. And also in a large lecture class, I have to plan and get everything prepared ahead of time, right? So we have to stay on pace because we have those assignments ready to roll when the time comes around. So given that, I'd say a breadth-based approach is probably better in a large lecture than a smaller discussion-focused class. And in fact, in a smaller class, there are lots of other ways you can hook the students through the discussion, through diving deeper into the interesting aspects of those topics. So, I think this is pretty conducive in a large lecture environment. And it's also important, since we are going pretty quickly, that we provide supports to the students. And so we work really hard in my class to give students a lot of support to help them, since we're moving quickly in class, so they have other opportunities to ask questions and get that deeper understanding of the material. So we have regular open office hours. This obviously requires having some TA support. Fortunately, I have some good TAs. And so we have regular office hours, normally 3-4 days a week for a few hours a day, where students don't have to have an appointment. They can just come in, work with the TAs on their questions. We've actually partnered with the Learning Center on our campus. And some of these office hours are coordinated with their tutoring hours as well. So they have fixed tutoring hours, and we send TAs there both to help students and also help the tutors if they need help explaining things as well. So we provide that as a support. I make sure all my lecture slides are available online, and I strongly encourage students to download them and print them out before class, and kind of giving them some study skills here as well to let them know, you don't have to write everything down. If you have these slides, a lot of it's written down for you, and then you can just fill in the details. So that kind of helps them keep up with the pace. We also provide lecture recording. So here at Mizzou, we use Panopto as our way of recording lectures. So we record all lectures and post those to Canvas afterwards. So this means if they miss something in class, if something was a bit too fast, they can always go back, rewatch that segment of the lecture to fill in their notes. Now, trade-off of making lecture recordings, it de-incentivizes attendance. So to kind of counteract that, we do use iClicker in our classes. So I say it's a large lecture class, but it's not straight lecture. I don't go in and just lecture for that whole period of time straight. We have frequent breaks where I pose them iClicker questions, and I was told that this is the idea of think, pair, share. I let them partner up when they're answering their iClicker questions, so they can talk to their neighbors, work together to try to get the answers. And we use the geolocation aspect of iClicker. They actually have to physically be in the lecture hall to be able to answer the iClicker questions. And so that's how we try to keep attendance high, despite the fact that we make the lecture recordings available. So this is the big drawback pace, and some ways that you can kind of help provide support to students in the presence of that if you choose to go with a breadth-based approach. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to talking to you all in the breakout sections.